Thank you to those of you tuning in, some of you for the fourth time, and others among you may have joined us along the way. And happy Hanukkah, as Tamar mentioned. Today, as promised, I will be trying to wrap up this series on how do we consider the history of the Jews of New York, not only through historical events, but also through particular places, sites, and even creative literary representations that convey some of the sense of the lives of the Jews in New York. And this final portion I've entitled In Transit, for two reasons, or maybe more than two, we will see. Transit, of course, in the most simple form of transportation, is basic to the life of the city, and something that we will be addressing very soon. But in transit also implies something that does not last forever, something that is transient, something that changes. And just to move us into this theme, if you have a quick look at that opening slide, if we can have that, yeah, thank you. What we see is a photograph from the Lower East Side in Manhattan, the Eldridge Street Synagogue, which had once been one of the largest and most active and most veteran Jewish congregations located in Lower Manhattan. And because the neighborhood itself has gone through important transitions over the course of time, the Lower East Side of Manhattan is today not really a major hub of Jewish residents. Rather, if you look next door to the Eldridge Street Synagogue, you'll see what's something that is much more typical of the area today, namely the influx of immigrants from other parts of the world, and in particular, a great number of migrants and who have settled from China. And the Lower East Side of the Jewish historical memory is today a neighborhood with a rather diverse population, including those from Asia and including those from all around Latin America. This is a bit symbolic. I mean, the synagogue itself, some of the important synagogues of yore around New York City, because the neighborhoods in which they were located passed through a transition of populations, no longer function as synagogues. The Eldridge Street Synagogue does function, but mostly as a museum. And the irony, of course, is that some of the older and smaller synagogues established by Jews around New York City in already pre-existing buildings rather than purpose-built as synagogues, some of those synagogues had themselves in a previous lifetime been churches of one or another Protestant denomination. And so it goes. There's a cycle in which buildings, neighborhoods, residents, groups filter in and out of the city, in and out of neighborhoods. And as I say, this will be one of the leitmotifs, the guiding ideas that I hope we will take away from the session today. And it's in that light that, as I've written in one or two places, there's a sense in which the history of Jews in New York, as in fact in many other places, is more usefully remembered or represented as a history of several generations at a time, 2, 3, 4 generations at a time may describe an arc of continuity in a particular place, but it's very rare. It happens, but it's very rare to get 5 generations or more of Jews living in one particular area or even one particular city. That doesn't mean that Jewish history stops. It means that it moves. It carries on elsewhere, and it moves around as was always the case. It's one of the links between the history of the Jews in New York and the history of Jews in general throughout the ages. Interestingly enough, it's also very much connected to the history of Americans. Americans, by far, are among the most mobile populations in modern history. They've always been mobile, moving easily from place to place, from one part of the country to another. I did mention in an earlier session that at the height of Jewish population in New York City, which took place by the early 1960s, there were about 2 million Jews living in New York City, and that number fell to only 1 million a decade later. It's clear that those Jews didn't just disappear. They moved. Most of them moved to the suburbs in the tri-state area, but many of them moved elsewhere in the country, California, Florida, and so on. So that transition and being in transit and being in a flow is very much a part of the story and not just the sort of permanent markers of Jewish presence that we looked at last week in terms of the monuments and memorials and so forth that mark the presence and the passage of Jews through the history of the city. Now, to begin our discussion today, I want to draw your attention to one of my favorite poems. It's called New York. It was written in Hebrew by a poet by the name of Shimon Ginsberg. It was written in 1927, or at least published in 1927. And as you will soon see, the poem relates not only to the city as such, but also very much touches upon symbols of the transit of people through the city. We're going to hear about trains, bridges, boats on the river. This movement, this is going to be, as you will see, an important motif brought up in the poem. But let me read it with you for a few moments, and then I'll try and reflect on some of its symbolisms and some of its language. And again, this is a Hebrew poem, which I have translated here into English, but it was written in Hebrew. It was meant to be read by Hebrew readers. It was published in the United States during a time when there was a substantial community of Hebrew writers and poets and those who would read the journals in which their creations were published. And it begins, I won't read you the entire poem, which is actually quite long, but I've selected certain excerpts that I think are most relevant and perhaps even most poignant. New York, a poem bricked in divine yet diabolical prose, you tower to endless heights, and below, hemmed between your walls, we, multitudes of minuscule dwarfs. Your song has no tempo, no rhythm, a din and cacophony of tongues. Your day, New York, is a brazen, tumultuous, pulsating clamor. Jonah at Nineveh, Yonah Hanavi. Jonah at Nineveh could not have heard its like, nor might Wagner's ear have imagined its pitch. Nightfall, and the train bears me across Williamsburg Bridge. Frozen, it spans the water from bank to bank. A spellbound wrought iron beast Og of Bashan's giant horse. Far below, tiny lights flash with secret fire through the vast darkness. My bereft soul seeks them, yearning to become as one with their illumination. Who lit them, these sparks that the Creator once did hide? It is the heart of man, to whom he bequeathed some fraction of understanding. The ship passing below, steered unseen by command of the Almighty Navigator, as I sensed over the city an outstretched providential arm. And all that night long, I heard a new song as the din and burden of New York lifted away to become a hymn of hope. We're going to pause here. It's not the end of the poem. We'll see that in a moment. I'm just going to pause here with the first slide before us to touch on some of the important symbolic elements. I've already mentioned the symbols that deal with movement, with transit, transportation, the bridge, the train. There is something even, I would say, personally meaningful to a poet who writes in Hebrew, who came from Europe as an immigrant, to put into his poems the symbol of a bridge, where the poem is, in a sense, itself a bridge, a linguistic bridge, that the poet who has wrought this bridge in writing a Hebrew poem in America, in New York City, bridging, as it were, the culture of Jewish Europe and the culture of Hebrew in the Yishuv in Palestine of that time, bridging those Jewish worlds with one poem in which he can refer constantly back and forth between local elements about New York being this massive, unbelievably gigantic structure, a manifestation of civilization, and yet it is also diabolical, it's also overwhelming, it can be even threatening. There are elements in which this cultural bridge of a Hebrew poem written in New York, elements that recall other eras of Jewish culture. There are biblical references here. There's Jonah. There is Og Melech HaBashan, Og the king of Bashan. These are biblical references in the on the right-hand side of the slide. If we can just have the words back for a moment on that slide. I'm going to, yeah, that's right. If we can sort of blow that up. Thank you. There's language on the right-hand column here that is biblical but also is repeated in Jewish liturgy. For example, the outstretched arm in Hebrew is Yado Netuya, familiar to every Hebrew reader and even to many among you today as language lifted directly from the Passover Haggadah, as is the next phrase, a new song, Shir Chadash. These are literary allusions to cues, cultural cues that all of Ginsberg's readers were sure to pick up on. And the idea of lifting phrases from a liturgical text like the Haggadah of Pesach is a way of referencing the basic idea of Pesach, of the Passover story, which indeed is liberation from slavery in the historical sense, but also prayers for future redemption in the Messianic era in the deeper sense. So all of that cargo, all of that freight is loaded into some of these phrases that Ginsberg put into this part of the poem. I also want to reference the tiny lights, the secret fire, the sparks that appear in the poem in this section. And these are familiar to many of you and certainly to all of Ginsberg's readers as references to Jewish mysticism, to the Kabbalah, to the belief in the secret mystic illumination of divine power that attended the creation of the world and whose redemption becomes a process culminating with the the final messianic eschatology. So this idea of hidden sparks, nitzotzot, and the Creator having hidden them, and then changing the meaning of these hidden lights in order to reference the electric lights of the city that the poet sees as he's crossing the bridge, sitting on that subway train, crossing the bridge between Manhattan and Brooklyn, and he sees these lights down below, and he experiences this mystic yearning to merge his own soul with those miniature lights who represent the souls of the people of the city. So it's a very complex and very rich fabric of symbolism and literary and cultural illusion that he's playing with here. Let's move on to the end of the poem, which comes back to the bridge motif. Upon my return by day toward the city, yet another bridge I behold. And this one is the Brooklyn Bridge, strung with lofty cords of iron, the very harp of heaven, patiently awaiting the strumming hands of the high musician to come and play upon it, upon the harp, the great hymn of the future. It's very hard for me to imagine a more beautiful anthem in Hebrew for the city of New York, which Ginsberg adopted as his own, although, as I said, he had very mixed feelings about the city. Some of those rather discordant, dark feelings come through in earlier parts of the poem, but the poem does end in this crescendo of the great hymn of the future being played by the divine hands themselves on the harp, the heavenly harp, imagined here as the harp-like shape of the cables on the Brooklyn Bridge. And of course, the playing of God's song upon a harp brings us back to the book of Psalms, where the harp figures as a motif in one of the most famous passages, by the rivers of Babylon. There we sat down, and the harps of the Jews are hung on the trees, and they cannot sing the Lord's song in a strange land. And yet here it's reversed, it's inversed by the poet who says, here on this harp, God himself will come and play the great hymn of the future. So all in all, as I say, I see this as a very interesting evocation, not only of this sort of entrancing relationship between the poet as a literary creator, his sense of himself as bridging the cultural worlds of Europe, the Hebrew civilization being developed in Palestine, Eretz Israel, and the massive Jewish life being built up in America, and specifically in New York City. And it all comes together in this marvelous poem that hinges on many different images of transition, transit, bridges, and travel. Now, as long as we're on the issue of bridges and travel, I'm going to insert here a very different image and a very different person. Those of you who are familiar with the history of New York City may recognize the man in the photo here. His name was Robert Moses. As you might be able to guess from his surname, he was of a Jewish parentage. His parents and ancestors were Jews from Central Europe who had immigrated to the United States. Now, Robert Moses was by no means, and not even by his own reckoning, a Jewish figure or could possibly conceive of himself as being mentioned in a lecture about Jewish history. Robert Moses himself disliked any mention of his Jewish background. He distanced himself personally from Jewish associations. He really had no time or patience or interest in any of that. And in that sense, he distanced himself quite a lot from his own family and so forth. Nevertheless, it might be interesting to ask why he never changed his name. But that's a kind of a footnote that you might want to store away. Why is Robert Moses in this presentation? Well, first of all, Robert Moses is the man in charge of all of the civil engineering projects that took place in New York City and beyond New York City from the 1920s to the 1960s. His position, he was not an elected official. He was appointed to the civil engineering part of the city administration under Mayor LaGuardia. He went on to assume control under his Office of Planning and Infrastructure for the city of major water reservoirs in upstate New York, was given, in fact, administrative control over water resources and the ways in which that water could be conveyed to the city, which made him a powerful figure in New York State politics and administration. Eventually, he was the architect, and he established the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, so that not only was he in charge of water resources, but he also took over the entire management of New York Harbor and the environment of the harbor, of New York Bay, which links the bi-state New York, New Jersey area, and everything associated with it, including the building of bridges and tunnels across the Hudson that we are all familiar with today, the George Washington Bridge, the Lincoln Tunnel. These were all really projects that he either conceived or oversaw, or both. The same is true of the Whitestone Bridge, the West Side Highway, the East Side Highway, and the Cross Bronx Expressway. The list seems to be endless. This is a man who had his control over everything that had to do with infrastructure, movement, transit, and power and water resources. You name it, he was the czar, if you will, of everything that made New York City, in its current post-war manifestation, the place that we know today. You'll notice that in the upper right of the slide, there's an image of Lincoln Center, another one of Robert Moses's pet projects, where he oversaw the demolition of huge swaths of slum tenements on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. Slum clearance was his way of dealing with the problem of poverty and the ghettoization of minorities in slum districts. What happened to all those people, not only in the Upper West part of Manhattan, but also in the Bronx, where the Cross Bronx Expressway, with its bridges and tunnels and flyways and ramps, cut straight across the living flesh of neighborhoods which were split asunder and never to recover. What happened to all those people? Well, they overcrowded into other parts of the city, creating new tenements and new slums, or in major new municipal housing projects, which were conceived on a large scale, but ended up not really being a viable replacement for living in slum conditions. Lincoln Center, as this centerpiece, this jewel in the crown of the urban renovation, the urban renewal of the Upper West Side, not only was it a showpiece of New York City as a center for the performing arts, but also it symbolized Moses's plan to retain a large middle and upper middle class element who would be the consumers of culture, to retain them close enough to New York City to be able to come and go freely, and hence his vision of mass transportation not by railroad or by other forms of public transport, but rather by automobile, and hence his focus on highways and tunnels and bridges, and the link between New York City and its environing suburbs was all part of this sort of master plan to recreate New York City as a metropolitan hub with a large periphery. And now I mention this partly because obviously Jews living in New York City were part of this entire story affecting all of the residents of New York City during those decades. As residents of New York, like many others, they were on the move from neighborhood to neighborhood, from the neighborhoods in the 5 boroughs to neighborhoods adjacent to the 5 boroughs, and then further afield in the tri-state area, as I've indicated, as transportation through tunnels, bridges, and so forth, and auto transport developed further and further. So it's clear that as Robert Moses's plans took shape, they affected the life of the city as a whole, and certainly it affected the lives of Jews as well. But that's not really the end of the story or the real importance here. The real importance has to do, first of all, with this cutting across of neighborhoods. Moses, as you can see, played with very, very large concepts. He played with the idea of the city as a whole, and indeed not only the city, but the city's periphery, its suburbs, its resources stretching far north into upstate New York, up to the Canadian border, the idea of New York, New Jersey as one administrative entity under the Port Authority. He thought in big terms. He did not think in terms of neighborhood, right? And if you recall, in one of the earlier sessions, I made a point of mentioning how central and crucial it was for Jews and their children to grow up, to live and to grow up and thrive in very concentrated particular neighborhoods where they could have the sense of really feeling at home, even of constituting a majority culture in their own environment. The idea that neighborhoods of that sort could be almost at will thrown down, cut across, split asunder, shoved aside, and the people shoved aside to move elsewhere as they might, either out to the suburbs or crowding further and further into inner city tenement districts in Brooklyn, in the Bronx, and in Manhattan. So all of this sort of the transitional aspect of neighborhood life is very much linked to the history of New York City. It's very much linked to the actions and projects overseen by Robert Moses. And it's also very important to understand how it was that before 1960 there could be 2 million Jews living in the city, and after 1970 only 1 million. Okay? And they, as I say, they didn't just disappear, they just moved. And part of the reason for that massive move and this very, very important change that took place, not only in the number of the Jews in New York, but in their proportion among the city's residents. And one final note about Robert Moses before we move on. I mentioned earlier that sometimes the story of Jewish families is best conceived in small successive numbers of generations, 2 or 3 or 4 generations, at the most 5. That seems to be what we can put our hands on when we describe what could be called Jewish continuity, or at least the continuity of particular families. Moses, as a person who represented a second or 2.5 generation Jew in America, because of the way he broke with his family background, distanced himself, estranged himself from anything having to do with the Jewish presence, Jewish culture, Jewish identity. This is an interesting example of a very short-lived Jewish family with a continuity of only 2 generations to show for their particular family history as far as Jewish history is concerned. So there's transition, transit, building of the means of transportation, all built into this entire story of Robert Moses, and it's something to reflect upon. Now, to move on, we're going to go back in time to someone who also figured earlier in our series, to the poet Emma Lazarus. We considered her ideas and some of her writings in the 1870s and up to about 1882, with reference not only famously to the Statue of Liberty through her sonnet, The New Colossus, but also, as we saw, the incident at Ward's Island and her response to it in 1882. We're going to go back a decade earlier to her visit with her family to the summer resort area of many of the high class and social elite New Yorkers who maintained summer residences in Newport, Rhode Island. And Emma Lazarus's father and mother indeed built themselves a summer home in Newport, Rhode Island. And there, on one of the early visits just before the family established their summer residence there, Emma Lazarus went to pay a visit at the very famous synagogue known to all and sundry as the Touro Synagogue. But at the time, the synagogue was empty. It was not being used for the very simple reason that there really weren't any Jews. There was no Jewish community in Newport. And in fact, the idea that the Lazarus family would move, at least for the summer months, to a place like Newport had nothing to do with the fact that in some earlier generation there had been a Jewish community there. It had, as I said, much more to do with the fact that Newport became a favorite summering resort for the social elite of Manhattan. But she was there, and she paid a visit to the synagogue, and she wrote a poem called In the Jewish Synagogue at Newport, and she wrote this in 1871. And once again, I'll just read through with you some excerpts from the poem and then reflect upon its meaning and how does it fit into our larger story. And she talks here about Newport, here where the noises of the busy town, the ocean's plunge and roar can enter not, here meaning within the walls of the synagogue. We stand and gaze around with tearful awe and muse upon the consecrated spot. No signs of life are here. The very prayers inscribed around are in a language dead. The light of the perpetual lamp is spent, that an undying radiance was to shed. What prayers were in this temple offered up, wrung from sad hearts that knew no joy on earth, by these lone exiles of 1,000 years from the fair sunrise land that gave them birth? The funeral and the marriage now, alas, we know not which is sadder to recall, for youth and happiness have followed age, and green grass lieth gently over all. Nathless, the sacred shrine is holy yet, with its lone floors where reverent feet once trod. Take off your shoes, as by the burning bush, before the mystery of death and God. A very powerful poem indeed, and Emma Lazarus is registering this the transitory nature of life itself as symbolized by this empty synagogue, the dead language, as she put it, in which the prayers were inscribed, of course, in parentheses, not exactly dead, as we know from Shimon Ginsburg, who brought Hebrew poetry back to America, along with his fellow Hebrew poets and writers, but so much for the dead language. But at any rate, there is a reflection here on the transiency of life, and certainly it's being prompted by this visit to the empty synagogue and its the memories of those Sephardic Jews who once they had been expelled from the Iberian Peninsula and found their way, some of them, to the shores of North America and set up their community in Newport, Rhode Island, back in colonial times, but were no longer around. This experience of exile, of transplantation that lasted for a little while and then stopped. These are the images that she's registering. But the story is even more fascinating because Emma Lazarus considered herself the protege of one of America's greatest poets of her time, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, whose picture you see here on the left. Now, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, before the Civil War, also paid a visit to Newport and also noted the absence of the Jews who once lived there. And Longfellow had written a poem at the end of the 1850s called The Jewish Cemetery at Newport. And I won't read that poem with you, but suffice it to say that Emma Lazarus, when she wrote in the Jewish Synagogue in Newport, she was deliberately echoing and referencing Longfellow's poem, but registering her different opinion. Longfellow's poem ends with the final verdict of history as he surveys the graves of those long since dead generations of Spanish and Portuguese Jewish exiles who found their way to British colonial America. Longfellow said at the end of his poem, "And dead races do not rise again." The verdict of history on the Jewish people was that they weren't going to carry on. Now, Emma Lazarus took a different point of view. Yes, she said, green grass lieth over all, and there is no more marriage or funeral or prayer going on. Nonetheless, it is a sacred shrine like the burning bush, and it should be treated as part of the mysterious ways of life, death, and God. And of course, she, as a Jew, coming from a huge Jewish community in New York City, knew very well that Longfellow's very dark verdict, dead races do not rise again. She herself was not prepared to take that verdict lying down, and so she wrote this new version of looking at what remains behind of the historic colonial and early American Jewish community. The Touro Synagogue today is a museum, which many of you may have visited. It's not in New York City, but it's clearly linked in several ways to the history of the Jews of New York, if only through the person of Emma Lazarus. Now, Emma herself, of course, might be considered a figure of transition, because she is the fifth generation of Jews in her family in New York City from the colonial times up until the end of the 19th century. But she is one of three siblings in her family who did not marry and did not carry, they did not produce a next generation. In fact, four siblings, if we also include one of her siblings who moved to Germany and married a Protestant minister and left the Jewish narrative of the Lazarus, Nathan families. So that there is a kind of an end point in some sense when we look at Emma Lazarus as a representative figure of the history of the Jews of early New York, representing a fifth generation. And then after her, there are other descendants of those families, but they are from lateral descendants from other parts of the family tree. At any rate, we have here in one little bundle in this poem a great deal of food for thought about transiency, transitions, and so forth. Moving along towards our conclusion for today, before we have time for some questions and discussion. And for some reason, oh, here we go, it's moving now. Back to this question of transition. About the Eldridge Street Synagogue and the Chinese market next door, I've already spoken briefly at the very beginning. The center picture on this slide, those of you who were with us for the second lecture will identify it right away as the large wall mural on the side of a building in Brownsville, Brooklyn, at the corner of Herzl Street and Pitkin Avenue. And the Welcome to Brownsville, it is not a dream, if you will it, the quotation from none other than Theodor Herzl. This is, as far as I can understand, a wonderful symbol of transition, because the neighborhood, which had once been so thickly populated by Jews and so visibly and so intensely identified with the Jewish population in the area, so much so that the names of the streets in the area became Jewish names, such as Herzl Street. Again, I remind you, outside of the state of Israel, I think this is the only other place in the world where there is a Herzl Street. But this is a symbol of transition because Brownsville ceased being a major hub of Jewish residents and became an inner city ghetto of predominantly black and to an extent Latino residents as early as the 1960s, and we're now 60 years later. And this transitional aspect of the neighborhood is neatly captured in this mural. Finally, another symbolic representation of transit, transition, movement, and so forth. This wonderful poster which served as a New Year's greeting card, a Leshana Tova card representing the New Year as a ship arriving across the ocean the same way that the Jewish immigrants did. And you can see the ship arriving in the harbor with the Statue of Liberty, and this is in the form of a kind of a ship's ticket, which serves as a New Year's greeting. Once again, with the central motif of moving, of being in transit, and so on. Finally, transit, movement, no better place to end than with JFK International Airport. And I bring this to your attention because of what you see here in the picture. After at one point in the development of the airport, it was decided to dedicate 3 large chapels at the airport, just really outside the main part of the terminal area. 3 chapels devoted to Protestant, Catholic, and Jewish faith. Each building is of the exact same height. They are spaced far enough apart intentionally so that the shadow of one will not fall on another, emphasizing, as it were, the symbolic equality of these 3 major faiths of America as they became enshrined, or even, we might say, canonized in American cultural discourse by the 1950s, according to the rather famous formula, Protestant Catholic Jew. And that was the public culture side of religious diversity in America at that time. There were plenty of other religions in America then, and certainly there are plenty more now. But in the 1950s, the only ones that counted for anything in the public square were Judaism, Catholicism, and Protestantism. And there is, of course, a catch here. Of course, the Jews were never more than 3% of the American population, unlike the Christian population, of course, which is the vast majority. And yet here we have Judaism set up as one of the three major pillars of American public civilization, and its link to the idea of the belief in God. And this in itself, not only, of course, because it's at an airport and is therefore primarily linked to the idea of travel and transit, but also because this was a transitory moment for the Jews in American history, when for a generation or so, Jews enjoyed the reputation of being one out of three symbolic American religions, the religions of democracy. And that time is so long behind us that it's almost nostalgic to look at this picture now and to try to imagine what the planners of airport chapels would do today if they were given this as a project. Clearly, there would never today be this sort of focus on only three of the religious groups represented in the American national population. And so it represents an age in the post-war, Cold War time of American history when it became essential for the American public to talk about the Judeo-Christian ethic or heritage and to symbolize it concretely in this form. And at this point, I think we will say, Dayeno, thank you for listening. I've left time, hopefully, for a number of you to ask your questions and to receive at least partial answers.
I'd like to tell you that the way it looks from our Zoom, quite a big percent of our audience are either current residents of New York or past residents, and also they very much enjoy your introducing them to their heritage and the history of where they live. And Susan wants to know if you know whether the Eldridge Street Synagogue had a Rabbi Israel Isser Markovitz, if you're familiar with that.
I don't recall. It's a good question. Look it up, and I will look it up as well. It's Eldridge, by the way, with a D after the L.
There is a D there. It's my mispronunciation, yes. As I'm not a local of New York, so my apologies. I'd like to be.
Quite all right.
I also want to say something technical since the question comes up from many of you. All our sessions are recorded and then are uploaded to a website. So if you missed one of the previous sessions that some of you did, or this is the first time you're joining this series, you can make it all up. So don't worry, it's waiting for you on our website. Batya would like to know, are there parallel studies on the Jewish population for the city of Philadelphia?
That's a good question. Pretty much every major American city has had a Jewish community of medium or large size. And for pretty much every major Jewish community, there is at least one book history as well, and in some cases 2, 3, or more. Philadelphia has been the subject of several histories, the Jewish community of Philadelphia. I mean, apart from the fact that obviously Philadelphia is mentioned rather often in the more general histories of the Jews in the United States, but there are in fact population studies as well as histories devoted to the Jewish community of Philadelphia. The same is true of Boston, Cleveland, Chicago, Los Angeles, Richmond, you name it, you can probably find a good history / social and demographic study for pretty much every place where there were sizable numbers of Jews.
Eliza asked before about the poem you read, the poem you translated. about the Hebrew version. Do you know where it can be found in Hebrew? Is it in a specific book?
Yes, it was published, if I'm not mistaken, in an anthology of Hebrew poetry that came out in 1927. I think it was also republished at the time, or very close to that time, in a Hebrew intellectual literary annual called Sefer Hashana Liyehudei America, the American Hebrew Yearbook. And it is also quoted, and I believe also presented bilingually, in a book on Hebrew poetry in America by Michael Weingrad.
Okay, Dov has also written to us now in the Zoom that it's online in the Ben Yehuda project, so which is a project that puts along the different Hebrew poems. So anyone who wants to look up New York can do that. So we have a lot of people sharing where they come from. Let's see, lots of thank yous. Okay, I'll share the Zoom with you later. But if there's no other historical questions, maybe I'll ask one. The chapel you showed from JFK, are they in use today? Do you know what they're?
I haven't been there lately. I imagine that they are occasionally in use. I don't know for sure to be able to say how frequently or how large you might find a community. There are other prayer spaces in the terminals as travelers through JFK as well as other airports are familiar with. But the chapels exist certainly as a kind of a monument to an era, not only in which a small room somewhere along the corridor of a terminal wasn't sufficient in terms of how do you represent this idea of the equality of religious freedom in the public eye, in the public sphere. So the building of the chapels was always more of an architectural and political statement than it was an actual, let's say, user-friendly type of arrangement. It was always more of a statement than something utilitarian. The fact that it's there, though, I suspect that there are people who use the chapels, be it only on occasion as they are traveling through.
I'm going to use this opportunity to invite our audience. Next Wednesday, we're beginning another series with Professor Renee Levin-Melamed, who will be speaking about women in the Cairo Gniza. And for those of you who are Hebrew speakers and live here in the Jerusalem area, next Tuesday is a very festive day for Bet Avichai. We're finally opening our doors, and you're very much invited to join us for Rosh Chodesh Tevet event. So if you're interested, check our website to come and join us. And thank you, everyone, with lots of information and people sharing their life stories here on the chat. So I'll pass the messages on to the professor. And thank you very much, Eli. Everyone seems to have enjoyed this series very much. Thank you for taking us to New York. For whoever's living in New York, enjoy your city. And for us living here at the moment, it doesn't seem to be possible to travel. So we do it through history. Thank you very much. Happy Hanukkah. And hope to see you all soon here on our screen.
Bye-bye.